Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at counter-human trafficking coalitions,
Okay.
specifically those operating in the Global South.
Interesting.
So we're using this great research article, an outcome-centered comparative analysis of counter-human trafficking coalitions in the Global South.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
It is.
Yeah.
But I think, today's deep dive is going to be super interesting because we're going to uncover some pretty fascinating stuff about how these coalitions actually operate
Yeah.
and what makes them successful,
Okay.
even when they're facing some pretty tough challenges.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a complex issue. When you think about it, you're trying to build these collaborations between all these different organizations.
Right.
And a lot of these countries in the Global South are dealing with political instability.
Yeah.
Economic problems.
For sure.
I mean, it's
not easy.
Yeah, it's not a walk in the park.
Exactly. And yet, this research focuses on 3 nationally scoped coalitions in sub-Saharan Africa.
Wow.
The Asia-Pacific Islands.
Okay.
And Southeast Asia.
Got it.
And all 3 of these are considered successful.
Really?
Not just by their leaders,
Oh.
but by the organizations involved.
Okay.
So that begs the question.
Yeah. How are they doing it?
How are they doing it?
Right.
That's what we're here to find out.
Right.
So how did the researchers go about this?
Well, they really wanted to make sure they were thorough, so they used a bunch of different approaches. Like, they looked at documents, questionnaires, they did interviews, even surveys.
Wow.
To get, like, a really complete picture of each of these coalitions.
Okay, so they really tried to, get down in the nitty-gritty.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, what they found was kind of surprising.
What's that?
So, these coalitions, they were all pretty different.
Okay.
When it came to, their structure and their activities.
Okay.
But there was one thing they all had in common.
Leadership.
Leadership, exactly.
Okay, so everyone loves a good leadership story. Well, of course.
So what was it about the leadership in these coalitions that was so special?
All right, so think about it this way.
Okay.
You've got this coalition leader.
Yeah.
And they're constantly checking in with everybody,
Mm-hmm.
making sure that all the members feel like they're being heard.
Yeah.
That their needs are being met.
Okay.
That's what the researchers were seeing.
Interesting.
Over and over again in these successful coalitions.
Okay.
And so they ended up identifying 6 key leadership practices.
6.
Yeah, that were consistently present.
Okay.
And one of the most important ones was this idea of fostering a sense of equity among the members.
Equity.
Yeah.
So it's not just about being in charge.
Right.
It's about making sure everyone has a voice.
That's exactly.
And feels valued.
Like they're an equal partner.
Yeah, like an equal partner in this whole thing.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it's not just about listening. They found that these leaders, they actually went out of their way to create a really positive relational environment. What do you mean by that?
So basically, everyone felt comfortable sharing their ideas.
Yeah.
Even if they disagreed with each other.
Oh, that's nice.
It was all about building trust and respect.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, you can have the best plan in the world, but if nobody trusts each other or feels like their ideas matter, it's just not going to work.
Exactly.
So this focus on equity and positive relationships, did that actually show up in the outcomes of the coalitions?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Really?
Yeah. So, for example, in one of the coalitions, the member organizations, they started adopting shared goals and program standards that the coalition had developed. And this led to some really noticeable improvements in the services that they were providing to trafficking survivors.
That's great.
Yeah, and even government officials were impressed.
Wow.
They noticed that the shelters run by the coalition members were meeting much higher standards than the shelters that were run by organizations that weren't part of the coalition.
So that really speaks to the power of collaboration.
Yeah.
And I guess it goes back to those strong leadership practices.
It does.
Creating that environment where everybody feels comfortable working together toward that shared goal.
Exactly. But it wasn't just about, warm, fuzzy feelings.
Okay.
These leaders, they also made sure that the coalitions were focused on actually getting things done.
Mm-hmm.
So they were facilitating constructive decision-making processes, and they were encouraging goal-oriented interactions between all the members.
So it was a balance of support and accountability.
It was a really nice balance.
Okay. Yeah. So it sounds like effective leadership in these coalitions wasn't just about being nice to everybody. It was about creating a structure where everyone could actually contribute.
Absolutely.
And thrive.
Yeah.
So we've talked about equity, positive relationships, a focus on goals.
Mm-hmm.
Were there any other leadership practices that stood out?
Yeah, so one that I thought was really interesting was this emphasis on positive influence.
Positive influence, okay.
So these leaders weren't just, managing their own organizations. They were actually going above and beyond to help the member organizations improve their own practices.
Okay, so hold on. Give me an example. How are they actually doing that?
So remember that coalition where everybody was adopting those shared program standards?
Yeah.
It wasn't like a top-down mandate or anything.
Okay.
The coalition leaders worked really closely with all the organizations to help them meet those standards. They offered guidance support.
Okay, so it was more about empowering them.
It was all about empowerment.
To improve.
Exactly.
Rather than just telling them what to do.
Exactly. It wasn't about, you have to do this or else.
Got it.
It was more about, okay, how can we work together to make this happen?
I like that.
Yeah.
So we've got equity, we've got positive relationships, we've got a focus on goals, we've got positive influence. Mm-hmm. What were the other two?
The last two were cultivating a positive relational environment.
Which we kind of already talked about.
Yeah, we touched on that one.
Okay.
And then the final one was the inclusion of diverse member organizations.
Diverse member organizations.
Yeah, and that one's really interesting.
Why is that?
Because it suggests that, a successful coalition isn't just about getting a bunch of like-minded people together.
Right.
It's about bringing people together who have different perspectives and different kinds of expertise.
So diversity of thought.
Diversity of thought, yeah.
That makes sense because you want people who are going to challenge each other.
Yeah. Push
each other to think outside the box.
Exactly, and that's what the researchers found. These coalitions that had a lot of diversity, they were more likely to come up with really innovative solutions to those really complex challenges of combating human trafficking.
So it's not about everybody agreeing all the time.
Right.
It's about actually valuing those differences.
Exactly.
And using them to make a bigger impact.
That's the key.
So forget the cookie cutter approach. Effective leadership in these coalitions was about creating this environment where different voices can be heard, where collaboration was encouraged.
Yes.
And where everybody was focused on achieving those shared goals.
That's right.
But these coalitions, they weren't just sitting around talking about leadership.
No.
They were actually out there doing things to combat human trafficking.
Right.
So what kinds of activities were they involved in?
That's a great question. Well, it's kind of like they each had a toolbox,
Okay.
They all had access to the same tools.
Okay.
But they used them in different ways.
Okay.
Depending on, the context,
So no one-size-fits-all approach.
Right, exactly.
Just like with the structures.
Yeah.
So give me some specifics.
Right.
What kind of tools are we talking about?
So we're talking about things like increasing victim identification.
Okay.
Providing legal services for survivors.
Got it.
Raising public awareness.
Okay.
Even pushing for policy changes.
So a lot of different things.
Yeah. There's a whole range of counter-trafficking activities.
Okay.
Some coalitions focused more on the direct services.
Okay.
While others were more into advocacy and trying to change the systems.
So different strategies, but all kind of ultimately aiming at the same thing.
Right. They all wanted to dismantle those trafficking networks.
Yeah.
And support survivors.
Okay, so can we look at any specific examples?
Yeah, sure.
Did any of the coalitions stand out in terms of their activities?
Yeah, so one that comes to mind is Community Nexus.
Community Nexus.
Yeah, that was the coalition in Southeast Asia.
Okay.
And they were really big on training and capacity building.
Okay.
For their member organizations.
Interesting.
Yeah, so they held all these workshops and training sessions multiple times a year.
Really?
On all sorts of topics related to counter-trafficking work.
So they recognized that in order to be effective, their members actually needed to have the skills.
They needed the knowledge.
The knowledge to do the work.
Absolutely.
It was an investment in their people.
Exactly. It was all about making sure everybody was equipped to do the job.
I like that.
Yeah, and it seems like it worked.
Really?
Yeah, the member organizations, they said that the training they got through Community Nexus actually helped them improve their services.
That's great.
And it also helped them strengthen their own internal practices.
Okay.
And advocate more effectively for policy changes.
Wow, so they really got a lot out of it.
Yeah, it sounds like it was a really valuable experience for them.
Okay, so Community Nexus was all about empowering its members through training.
Right.
What about the other two coalitions?
So Sector Bridge, the one in Sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
They had done one training.
One?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Covenant Alliance in the Asia Pacific, they hadn't done any at all.
Wow. It's a pretty big difference.
It is, yeah.
So even though training is something that a lot of people think is super important,
Right. You would think it would be a priority.
You would think so.
It wasn't universal for these three.
Interesting. So what were Sector Bridge and Covenant Alliance focusing on instead?
So Sector Bridge, they were really into knowledge sharing and collaboration between the members.
Right.
They had this system for exchanging information. They had regular meetings and even joint projects where organizations would team up to tackle specific trafficking issues.
So it sounds like they were all about leveraging the collective expertise and building a strong network.
Absolutely. It was all about teamwork.
Okay. What about Covenant Alliance?
Now, this is where it gets interesting.
Okay.
So Covenant Alliance's members, they were super active across a whole bunch of different counter-trafficking activities.
Like how many?
So get this, more than 60% of their members were engaged in 9 out of the 18 activities that the researchers were looking at.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot.
What do you make of that?
It's hard to say for sure. It could be that they were still trying to figure out what they wanted to focus on.
Okay.
Or maybe their members were just more similar to each other.
Okay.
So there was more overlap in what they were already doing.
Okay.
It's hard to know without more information.
Yeah.
But it definitely shows that these coalitions took different approaches.
Yeah, for sure.
To addressing human trafficking.
It's really fascinating to see how each one kind of tailored its activities to its own context.
Yeah.
And it sounds like they were all achieving positive outcomes.
Yeah, they were all doing good work.
Despite those different approaches.
Despite those differences, yeah.
But we haven't really talked about the structures of these coalitions yet.
Right.
Did the way they were organized play a role in their success? That's a great question. I mean, we've talked about leadership and activities.
Right.
But, we haven't really gotten into the structures of these groups.
Yeah.
So were they all kind of similar, or were there differences there, too?
Oh, there were definitely differences. Big time.
Really?
Yeah. So remember all those structural facets the researchers looked at?
51, wasn't it?
51. Yeah, things like, how is the coalition formed? Who's in charge? What are the membership requirements? How do they handle money?
Right. All the nitty-gritty details.
Even whether they all agreed on what human trafficking actually meant.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So 51 different things? Did they at least agree on some of them?
Surprisingly few.
Really?
Yeah, out of those 51, they only shared 19.
Wow.
Meaning that there were 32 areas where at least one of the coalitions was doing things differently.
So unlike the leadership practices, the structures were all over the place.
Pretty much.
So does that mean structure doesn't matter?
I wouldn't say it doesn't matter. It's more like there's no one right way to do it.
Okay.
The best structure for a coalition really depends on the context.
Okay.
The resources they have, their goals.
So what works in one place might not work in another. So it's like those leadership practices that we talked about. Those were like the solid foundation.
Yeah, like a strong base.
And then each coalition built its own structure on top of that.
Right.
Depending on its needs.
Yeah, they kind of customized it.
Okay.
And they even found that those structural differences actually influenced the relationships between the member organizations. Some coalitions were really collaborative and integrated, and others had more loose connections.
So even within a successful coalition, you can have different levels of connection.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
But I imagine even with great leadership and, a structure that works, there are still challenges to this kind of work.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, even in these successful coalitions, the leaders, they talked about things like it's hard to get people to participate consistently.
Yeah, that makes sense. Everyone's busy.
Right. Everybody's got their own stuff going on.
Organizations have their own priorities, and it's hard to stay focused on that.
Yeah. The big picture.
The big picture.
Long-term goal of coalition building.
And I imagine if people aren't showing up,
yeah,
or pulling their weight,
right,
that can really cause problems.
Can create tension. Yeah.
Undermine the whole thing.
Exactly.
So even with the best of intentions, it can be tough.
It can be really challenging.
To keep a coalition going.
Yeah.
Which is why I guess those leadership practices are so important.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture where everybody feels responsible.
Okay.
Where there's open communication.
Mm-hmm.
Where everybody feels valued and supported.
I like that.
That's what helps keep people engaged.
Yeah.
Even when things get tough.
It's like those leadership qualities have to come from everyone.
Yeah, it can't just be the leader.
Yeah.
It has to be everybody.
It's got to be like built into the culture of the coalition.
Exactly.
Okay, so for anyone listening who might be thinking about joining a coalition or even starting one, what would you say is the biggest takeaway from all of this?
I would say leadership matters.
Okay.
Like maybe even more than we realize.
Yeah.
It's those leadership practices, you know,
Hmm.
fostering equity, building trust,
Yeah.
promoting open communication, empowering members.
Those are really important.
Those seem to be the key ingredients for success.
Focus on those, and you'll be good to go.
You'll be well on your way.
Exactly. So focus on the leadership.
Yeah.
Keep those strong relationships.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to adapt as you go.
Right.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Absolutely.
And I guess one last thought before we wrap up.
Yeah.
This research focused on counter-human trafficking coalitions.
Right.
But I think these insights about leadership, they apply to any group of people.
I think so too.
Who are working together toward a common goal.
Absolutely.
So whether it's climate change,
right,
or poverty, or even just like improving your local community, these lessons are valuable.
They can really make a difference.
Absolutely. So to everyone out there collaborating
and
striving for positive change,
keep up the good work.
Remember the power of strong leadership.
Yes.
And the importance of building that supportive and inclusive environment.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning.
And keep diving deep.
We'll see you next time.